Hello and welcome to Access to HE, Unit 858, Introduction to Psychology. And this is the little assignment tutorial before you actually start to sit down and do your assignment. So hopefully a few hints and tips to help you on your way. Okay, firstly, make sure that you've completed all the online course and done any required reading. And you need to gather whatever notes you've made that you have and look over them before you actually settle down to do your assignment. Make sure that you're sort of comfortable with them and aware of what's going on. And especially look at some notes on the key approaches or perspectives for psychology and some of the ethical principles. If you haven't got anything on that yet, then you need to go away and look at that really before you start doing your assignment. Okay, so the key approaches or perspectives and the ethical principles for psychological research. Okay, let's have a look at the first task then. And the first task is an essay. It's 1,200 words, give or take 10%, usual way. And this is the title. Describe and evaluate 3 different approaches to psychology using studies to demonstrate your understanding of each approach. So you need to be aware of the different approaches, and then you need to give me an example of studies for each of the approaches that you write about. So it's describe and evaluate. So remember, when you're writing about an approach, don't just describe it, what it is. And evaluate means something. So you usually do like strengths and weaknesses. Why is it good? Why does it work? Good, bad. Is it a good approach, a bad approach? Is it useful? Those sorts of things. So not just a straightforward description. If you do that, you will lose some marks, okay? Because if you haven't done an evaluation, you're not taking it really up to the level 3 level that you should be doing. Okay. So, normal essay, academic essay, 3 sections, an introduction, a main body, which is your information and your discussion, your research, the information that you've gathered to answer the question, and the conclusion. Okay, so the intro introduces just the question and how you're going to approach answering it. The main body is all the information research that you've done. The conclusion is your summary of what you've come out with. And it might have some views that you've written, where you've sort of felt that maybe one approach is easier to use than another or something. You can put that in. Bear in mind that you're going to have to back it up if you've got some research. So don't forget you need citations all the way through. It's an academic essay. So citations through the body of it and a reference list at the end. Reference list following the standard Harvard format. Please use the guide if you're not sure of it, because I do check. Okay. And your reference list, as a reminder, is not included in the word count. So it's just the words that are in the body of the essay that I'm counting. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the guidance around task 1. First of all, you need to introduce how you're going to approach the essay, as I said. And as part of that introduction, you could include and have a couple of definitions of psychology. So just to show people, because there are slightly different interpretations of what psychology is, as always, there's always some sort of competing definition. But give me a couple of those just to show that you've been sort of reading up. And then maybe as part of your body of evidence, you could give me some examples of how psychology is used in different areas of practice. Don't go into too much detail, just so that I can understand that you know that there's different forms of psychology. So I've given you a little graphic here Hopefully that will be helpful, just so you get an idea of the different types. So you've got the pure basic psychology, which is a sort of study what you would be studying if you went to university and did it, and how it's broken down into social, child, abnormal. Most of that is to do with sort of mental health and how people work, really. Child development, managing mental health, that's abnormal psychology. Animal psychology sort of speaks for itself. It's part of biology. Parapsychology is a bit different, but and the applied branches are sort of how you would work with it, really. So clinical psychology, you'd very much sort of be into the treatment form. You'd be working with mental health services very often, or child development services, and dealing with a lot of maybe abnormal psychology and treating people very often. Industrial psychology, that's pretty much the psychology of work, really, and how businesses work. And there's quite a lot of psychology involved, down to doing sort of psychological testing, as in the HR role, when you're actually taking on new recruits, really taking on new people, to sort of psychology of the workplace, how teams work, how teams get the best out of each other, what are their motivations, those sorts of things, and how you can improve results. Educational psychology sort of speaks for itself. It's part of the child development, really, and it's the different approaches to teaching that work well or badly for young people. Um, Psychology of crime, that's very much focused on criminology, very much focused on working in the prison systems, in probation services, and that's people who work out, what motivates people to cause the crimes. There's some behavioural issues there. There's some forensic stuff. You've probably seen loads of sort of movies where forensic psychologists come on and do sort of profiling about the sort of people who could have caused that crime, or what the latest serial killer is probably thinking. So that's the whole aspect of his head. Military psychology, a bit like industrial psychology, really. But it's psychology of how the services work, really, and how to get the best out of people then, and how to improve their performance, how to get guys working together as a brigade and a platoon, those sorts of things. And also the sort of strategy, like strategy for war, even. There's a psychological aspect to that as well. Mental health sort of speaks for itself. It's usually a sort of treatment role, very, very much part of the clinical psychology role, really. But you could also be someone who's got a psychological background but works in the therapy service. Clinical psychologists very much diagnose, whereas people who work in therapy, like they might provide counselling, they might provide CBT, those sorts of things, some other behavioural therapies, behaviour modification work, to help people change and improve their mental health. And psychology in law, well, it's an adversarial role, really. So thinking, giving lawyers some sort of background in why somebody might do what they do might help, particularly in criminal law. Sort of relates to the psychology of crime as well, but also sort of think about motivations, and also to help sort of lawyers sort of find their way around things. So if you can imagine, how to manage a judge, how to approach people in the right way, how to, if you say this, what will happen, how to manage your courtroom so that you get the best out of everybody. There's quite a lot of psychological aspects to that sort of work. Okay, so those are the branches of psychology. So you don't need to write about all of them, but you could just pick 2 or 3 that you might want to write about. It just really needs a sentence. It's not asking for a huge amount. Okay, now we go on to look at the perspectives. And there are nowadays 7 major perspectives. Um, some people only teach 5. That's fine. Usually you'll know psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, biological, and humanistic. You might not have done that much on cross-cultural and evolutionary. There's sort of a slightly newer edition that some people teach and some people don't. But the big 5 are psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, biological, humanistic. So when you are writing your essay, you need to at least pick from those 5. The other 2 don't matter so much, I would say, unless you've got found a particular interest in them. But definitely pick at least 2 out of the big 5. Okay. And they've all got different approaches, and they've all got different pieces of research that you can use as examples. Okay, so just for an example, psychodynamic is really the sort of analytical, one of the most analytical perspectives. And so Freud was probably one of the most active researchers in the psychodynamic perspective. So you might want to think about Freud's work with little Hans, little boy who was afraid of horses, and how Freud interpreted that. You could look into that. For the behavioral, classic example for behavioral would be somebody like Skinner and his sort of fairly well-known operant conditioning, which sort of came out of Pavlov and the dog. Okay, so operant conditioning, giving rewards, done with lots of animals, went on to do it with humans as well. Getting people to learn things by giving them sort of rewards or taking away rewards. Have a look into that. Cognitive, one of the most well-known ones was Loftus's work on fake memories. You could use that as an example, or you could find another one that you might find more interesting. Biological, there's quite a few biological studies about MRIs, which you could look into. And one of my favourites is Phineas Gage and the work that Phineas Gage, a chap from the 1800s who had a pole land through his head, and amazingly he survived. It went in one end and came out the other side, and he did survive, but he had a fair bit of damage through his brain, as you can imagine. And there was some great research done from Phineas Gage on lesions, the lesions of the brain, and how they change behaviour. So it was actually quite interesting. And he lived for many years as well. So if you haven't heard about him, do look him up. But there are other biological stuff on twins as well, which is quite a common one. And the humanists, well, there's Rogers and his Q sort research. Rogers is one of the great humanist exponents. He sort of pretty much created the therapy style, the humanist therapy style, which is still very, very well used today. And he did some work on Q sorts, which is getting people to assess themselves. And it's really, he compared somebody's ideal self to their actual self, and like their vision of their ideal self, and how close it really was to their actual self. So that was quite interesting as well. So I've given you some ideas. Obviously, you may have come across other ones that you find more interesting. That's fine. But when you write about the major perspectives, I want one of those study examples. Just a little sentence about the study to show me that you understood what the perspective is and, why the study was used, really. So you need to outline the different approaches. As I said, give me an outline of them, a couple of sentences, and then evaluate. So you've got to pick 3. So you don't need to do all 7 approaches. You can outline 5 of them you want and then do an evaluation on 3 of them. Okay, and choose the ones that you think are particularly interesting. Could be behavioural, cognitive, biological, psychodynamic, like I said. But whichever 3 you choose, you need to refer to the studies, okay, as examples of that approach. So it's an evaluation. Remember, evaluation, strengths and weaknesses, good points, bad points, where they work, where they don't, however you want to evaluate it. Use your study to help with your evaluation. Okay. And then finally, you need to summarize the key points in your conclusion. Okay, as is normal in an assignment. Okay, so that was the essay part of it. Usual rules apply. Citations all through the body, as I've said. References at the end. References don't count in the word count. I'll go over that again just to make it sure. So we're looking on to task 2 now. And for those of you who've already done the sociology one, this isn't that different. It's just that you don't have to do the verbal overview because you're not actually giving a presentation. So all they want is you to prepare some slides and some notes pages for a presentation, okay? So you don't have to do the verbal overview. You just need to upload your slides and your notes. And the presentation is on the ethical implications of research in psychology. So if you haven't read up on ethics yet, do refresh yourself because that's what you're going to be writing about. And there's a little scenario that it wants you to address, really. So you're a psychologist who wants to undertake research into teenagers' experience of online bullying. Okay, so think about some of the issues that might come up in the bit of research that you do. Notice I've highlighted teenagers. That's really important because a teenager is telling you that they're under 18. Okay, and there are issues about what consent they can give, which you need to look up, and whether they need the consent of their parents and how and why, and if there are any other issues about working with young people. Okay, so please don't forget that bit of it. So you look at the standard ethical issues that will be for any piece of research, but then you add, make some extra points about teenagers, about young people, okay, under the age of consent, we assume. Okay, bit of guidance for that. 5 slides. You can put more details on them than in some of these assignments because you're not going to have a voiceover, okay, and some notes pages to go on the side. Okay, they should still add up to about 500 words, so it's not huge. So you're going to be very succinct and sharp in what you're writing. Okay, you could include as one slide, you could include the British Psychological Society's Code of Human Research Ethics you want, or you could have a slide on, a list of what the main ethical principles are. Such as voluntary participation. I've got a little slide for you, but you can create one of your own as well. So once you've got the main ethical principles, you need to explain their importance in the context of research, and don't forget that bit about teenagers. So importance in general research, and you can add to that with your notes pages, okay? And then some issues, particularly for teenagers. So you can highlight those and then fill it out a bit in your notes pages. I've done a list of the classic sort of ethical issues that everybody looks at, and this follows the writings of the British Psychological Society as well, the BPS. Okay, so the major issues that you need to think about are informed consent. And I've got a description of the issue here. Did participants give full consent? Was it fully informed? Did they know what it was all about? And just out of interest for you, you don't really have to write about this much, but you might want to draw it in a bit. How do we deal with it? What's the gold standard? And that the second list is sort of pretty much the gold standard if you're doing a piece of research. So focus on informed consent, really important. Deception is another one. Were you telling the truth? Did they know what it was all about? were they dragged in for a chance of £20, and if they come and sort of do this uh, to a quiz, but actually they're being assessed, sort of thing. Are you telling the truth? And could this cause any additional stress to them in their life if they found out they were being lied to? Lots to think about that. Again, how do we deal with it? I've got all that there for you just for the future. You don't need to write that a lot, but lack of right to withdraw. You have to remember that one of the ethical issues is people can leave a psychological study anytime they like. Now, what no matter what other people say to them, even if they've been paid, they can still leave, and you cannot withhold the money because that's unethical. A failure to protect someone from harm. If your experiment causes somebody more harm, that is an issue. Okay, and harm doesn't have to be just physical harm. It could be stress, embarrassment, anxiety, really, and it's psychological harm as well. So think about this, because we're already looking at something about online bullying, which is quite painful for young people. So the way you expose them to it can be quite risky. So you'd need to do risk assessments. That's something you might want to mention, that any of these ethical issues will need a risk assessment on exactly what you're going to do before you do it. Okay, so remember this, because the failure to protect from harm can be quite an issue because they are young people as well. So you take responsibility for them more than even you would with an adult. Okay, sort of makes sense, really. Lack of confidentiality. Is the personal information protected? Big deal nowadays. Everyone's very concerned about their data. So will this sort of piece of research go all around the world with my name in it? No, hopefully not. And make sure that whatever you're creating, um, it makes it not possible for you to work out who the person is, because sometimes people are very sloppy when they do this and they use proper initials or they use a date of birth or something, which actually people could actually work out who they are. So lack of confidentiality is really important. Data protection is really, really important. And lack of privacy. Was the person's personal privacy invaded? And that's one. You're talking about online bullying, so we need to be a bit careful here. How are we going to do this? How are you going to observe them? This is particularly difficult when you're doing a study where people aren't aware. You are allowed to do studies like that, but you have to do it in a very discreet way. And we do sort of observations on people in a natural environment. You can't do a setup environment for when people are not aware they're in a study, because they find that quite upsetting afterwards, and they find out you've been using them. But you can do that randomly, like if you go and sort of look at people in the street, you can do that, but there are parameters to it which you need to look at. So lack of privacy is quite important, really. You wouldn't follow someone into the toilet to do a piece of research, okay, because that would be considered a step too far. However, you can actually watch someone doing their shopping or something like that if you have a level of discretion that they don't feel their privacy is being invaded. Sometimes it's quite a personal thing, and sometimes someone will tell you, and you have to sort of just leave out their work. Just have to leave out their element of it. There's a lot of issues about debriefing people afterwards, which is a bit of a catch-all that psychologists use to get out of a lot of these things, but you do need to be sort of quite careful about how you do that without being exploitative. Okay. Anyway, those are the main issues that we look at when we're thinking about ethics. As I said, I've got a sign here, don't forget they're teenagers. It doesn't change anything on this list, but it does add this other extra thing, particularly around consent. Okay, at the top one. Can a teenager give informed consent? You need to risk assess that. What would be the risk? Yeah. What would their parents say? Do their parents know they're involved? I would say parents would need to be involved, need to know that. So you'd have to get parents' permission. Okay, so lots of things for you to think about and write about. Usual thing, if you're unsure what to do, contact me on WhatsApp and I'll give you some guidance or advice. Okay. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a starter for what you're doing, so you're not going into it empty-handed. But if you've done the course, if you followed the course, you should have at least read up on this stuff anyway, so it should be fine. Okay, fine. Final slide. Usual uploading thing needs to go up in 3 files. Your essay, which should be a Word doc essay. Your slides, preferably a PowerPoint if you can. As I said, you don't need voiceovers, so that makes it a bit easier set of slides. And in your note pages, Word docs again, please. So should be 3 uploads. I'll be looking for 3 from everybody. Hit the hand-in date, please. Again, you know the rule. If the hand-in date, say if you haven't had an extension agreed, will affect your mark. Make sure everything's referenced, particularly the essay. All the citations are in there. You can put citations in your slides, in your notes page as well. You can add references to the bottom of your essay. They're not included in the word count. You can add references to the bottom of your notes page. They're not included in your word count. Run through the slideshow, make sure it looks okay, something hasn't gone a bit wacky while you're doing it, and do proofread your essay. Look out for your typos and your silly bits of grammar that sometimes will be picked up later on. Sometimes it's always easier to read it after a while when you go back because you suddenly see the glaringly obvious stuff. Okay. Good luck. As I said, I'm available on for WhatsApp if you want to discuss anything. Thank you. And I'll see you again for another tutorial on something.